In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. Greetings to all of you at St. Basil American Coptic Orthodox Church in San Diego, together with your dear priest, Father Michael Maximus. You who are participating in this series of presentations on the wonderful book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, the well-known and influential Christian writer of the 20th century. I was blessed to visit California in 2017, and I spent a week teaching at the St. Athanasius and St. Cyril Coptic Orthodox Theological School. The closest I came to San Diego was a visit to the Pine Valley Bible Conference Center, where I spoke to some of the Coptic Orthodox youth who were staying there. It might help if I give a little bit of background about myself before we begin to consider C.S. Lewis and his work Mere Christianity. I'm not Egyptian at all, but completely British. I was born into and brought up within a committed and prayerful evangelical Protestant family. I was very active in the life of our congregation and was committed to Jesus Christ from my earliest childhood. When I became an adult, I spent 3 years at an evangelical seminary training to be a pastor and missionary. I was always seeking a deeper and closer spiritual life with God, and this led me to experience and participate in a variety of modern Protestant movements. Yet I always found myself dissatisfied with what was being offered. It was usually an emotional experience that failed to transform my life in any meaningful and lasting manner. In fact, it was while I was at seminary and still seeking a more transforming encounter with God that I discovered some books about prayer from traditional Roman Catholic authors, such as Thomas à Kempis and his book The Imitation of Christ, and Therese of Lisieux and her autobiography. In these words I found new possibilities and new opportunities to grow into union with God, which I eagerly embraced. Even as an Orthodox priest and Christian, and appreciating that later Catholic works do not always represent the authentic Orthodox spirituality, there is much to be valued and great insight in these writings, which set me on the journey towards orthodoxy. Therese of Lisieux says of her love for God, "Love proves itself by deeds. So how am I to show my love? Great deeds are forbidden me. The only way I can prove my love is by scattering flowers, and these flowers are every little sacrifice, every glance and word, and the doing of the least actions for love." There is something profoundly orthodox about such an instruction and such a sentiment. And it was natural perhaps that reading these and other words, I would be led to seek in the treasures of traditional Christian spirituality more and more depths and more treasure. I had known nothing very much of the Orthodox churches, and it was only now that I started to read the books which many converts from Evangelical Protestantism find useful, such as The Way of a Pilgrim and The Orthodox Church by Callistos Ware. These led me to become convinced that orthodoxy was the apostolic and the original and authentic Christian faith. I first tried to make a prayer rope out of wool when I was still at my evangelical seminary, even though I had no idea what a prayer rope looked like. I became orthodox by conviction before I had met any Orthodox Christians. And through the providence of God, I was baptized into the Coptic Orthodox Church in 1994, 27 years ago. And in 2009, 12 years ago, I was ordained a priest in the Coptic Orthodox Church. I serve now in the Diocese of the Midlands in the UK under Amber Misael, and I serve especially in our congregations in Liverpool and Manchester. I am presently studying for a Master's in Theological Studies at the Holy Sophia Coptic Orthodox Seminary in New Jersey, and I hope to complete these studies in the summer this year. My background in evangelical Protestantism means that I am both very aware of Protestant influences on our ancient and apostolic Orthodox Church, but also very sympathetic to the spiritual journey that many Protestants find themselves upon. Indeed, many of the questions which evangelical Protestants have about the Christian faith are shared with many of our own youth. It is with this balance between constructive criticism and generous sympathy that I approach the subject of our study, the little book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. I am well aware of what our Orthodox Church teaches, and I am concerned to promote and preserve this authentic and apostolic faith and life. But I am also convinced that I should always be prepared to try to understand what others are saying when they speak about the faith, and to find the positive aspects as far as possible. This is how we must approach C.S. Lewis and Mere Christianity, with constructive criticism and generous sympathy, being realistic about those aspects of the book which are not orthodox, but being considerate of the reasons why the book was written, and the context and the audience in which and for which it was produced. We have to start by asking who C.S. Lewis was, since this will have an important bearing on how we read and understand his book. Even an orthodox text such as On the Incarnation by St. Athanasius has to be understood in the context of the controversies which were taking place at the time it was written, about whether or not the Word of God was really God. And it has to be read with an appreciation of how St. Athanasius came to play a part in this controversy. In the same way, we need to know something about C.S. Lewis if we want to understand Mere Christianity in the way he intended, and with a generous and sympathetic perspective. He is most famous, perhaps, for the Narnia series of books. But perhaps his most interesting writings are those which deal with the faith, and one of these is Mere Christianity. C.S. Lewis is Clive Staples Lewis. He was born in Belfast in Northern Ireland in 1898. His family were members of the Church of Ireland, which is the Protestant Episcopal Church there, and not the Roman Catholic Church. In fact, his mother's father was a priest in the Church of Ireland and baptized Clive. He was taught at home by various tutors until he was 9 years old, and with his older brother Warnie he invented a fictional land peopled by animals, and as a child he wrote and illustrated his own stories. As a young teenager he lost his Christian faith and became an atheist. His mother had died of cancer when he was 9, and he was sent away to the first of several private boarding schools in England by his father. But he became interested in mythology and the literature of the northern European pagan religions and peoples. His interest continued and embraced ancient Greek literature as well as that of Ireland. And in 1921, as an adult, he considered himself Irish, though a great many of his readers will probably consider him English. This is because he spent so much of his adult life in England. In 1917, he entered Oxford University as a student, and he was shortly enlisted in the Officer Training Corps, and he saw active service at the Battle of the Somme, where in 1918 he was wounded by a shell and sent back to England to recover. The experience was an unhappy one and brought about a period of depression. Later on, Lewis wrote to a friend saying that his experience of the horror of war, along with the loss of his mother and his unhappiness at school, were the basis of his pessimism and atheism. He returned to Oxford University, where he gained outstanding results in Greek and Latin literature, and then in philosophy and ancient history, and finally in English. He became a fellow and tutor in English literature at Magdalen College in Oxford University, and he remained there until 1954, when he received the newly established chair of Medieval and Renaissance Literature at Magdalen College in Cambridge University, a post he held until his death in 1963. He had become an atheist, as he himself stated, because he was very angry with God for not existing, and equally angry with him for creating the world. Christianity had become no more than an obligation and a duty to him, and so without a living and life-giving relationship with God, he abandoned the Christian faith, though in a sense he had never really participated in it. At Oxford he translated a Greek poet whose words he felt best described his reasons for being an atheist. Had God designed the world, it would not be a world so frail and faulty as we see. Perhaps this is a typical condition for many people who consider themselves to be atheists. They are both angry with God for creating a world in which there is brokenness, but they also deny his existence, making their anger with him rather redundant. At Oxford University, C.S. Lewis made friends with a variety of other academics, including the devout Catholic J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He had also read some of the Christian fiction of the 19th century writer and theologian George MacDonald, and the book The Everlasting Man by G.K. Chesterton, another Catholic author. Lewis didn't want to accept the reality of God, and resisted as much as he could. He says of his experience, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen College, Oxford, night after night, feeling, whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. In the Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God, and knelt and prayed, perhaps that night the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." It was 2 years later, in 1931, after a late-night conversation with Tolkien and another Christian friend, that he finally committed himself to faith in Christ and became a Christian. Tolkien hoped that he would become a Roman Catholic, but he chose the Church of England and remained an Anglican for the rest of his life. This will have some relevance to our understanding of mere Christianity as we begin to study the first passages. After his conversion to Christianity, or his rediscovery of the faith of his early childhood, he produced a series of important and interesting books which were expressions in one way or another of his Christian faith. These included works of adult fantasy fiction, his Narnia series for children, and his more explicitly Christian works such as the Screwtape Letters, The Problem of Pain, The Case for Christianity, The Abolition of Man, and many more works that all deserve attention, including Surprised by Joy, an autobiographical account of his early life, and of course the subject of this series of studies, which you will be participating in over the next weeks and months, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity did not begin as a book, as will perhaps become obvious as your study together continues. The chapters are all very short, not usually more than 5 pages, which takes about 15 minutes to read. During the Second World War in 1941, Lewis had been asked by the head of religious broadcasting at the BBC, the national broadcaster, to produce a series of 15-minute radio programs about the Christian faith as he understood it. It was considered important that the British people should be reminded of the meaning and substance of the Christian faith in a simple and accessible manner during a time of conflict with an evil regime in Europe, which had the character of a moral conflict. For this reason, the first series of talks were called Right or Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe, and became the first section in Mere Christianity when it came to be edited and compiled by Lewis after the war. This series was so popular that he was invited to produce a second series of radio programs called The Case for Christianity, which were broadcast in early 1942, and these became the second section of Mere Christianity. A third series was broadcast towards the end of 1942 and was called Christian Behaviour, and this represents the third section of Mere Christianity. The final section was not produced and broadcast until 1944 and was called Beyond Personality, or First Steps in the Doctrine of the Trinity, and this appears as the fourth section in our book. So it makes sense that all the chapters are short. It also makes sense that the language is simplified, popular and familiar, because Lewis is not addressing theologians and academics, but the ordinary radio audience of millions during the Second World War. This is why he chose to speak and then write about mere Christianity. It was intended to be a reminder and a basic explanation of what Christianity stood for, presented in a way which would allow the maximum number of listeners to accept and be inspired by his description. From an Orthodox perspective, we have a problem with the idea of mere Christianity, the idea of those teachings which most Christians have in common. We don't understand this as representing apostolic and authentic Christianity at all. Ours is not a mere Christianity. We cannot reduce it to only that which we have in common with all the other Christian groups. It seems that what Lewis wants to talk about is already something deficient and something which we cannot easily benefit from. But if we remember what I spoke about as my own experience, that we need to reflect on mere Christianity with constructive criticism and generous sympathy, then we will not allow our immediate response to guide all of our study. On the contrary, we will want to know what Lewis understood by the term and what he was trying to achieve in these radio broadcasts which became the book. We have to turn to the introduction, Lewis's own introduction to mere Christianity, to find the answers to some of these questions. Lewis says of himself, "I am a very ordinary layman of the Church of England, not especially high, nor especially low, nor especially anything else." Of course, in one sense, he was not ordinary at all, but he does represent the broad and inclusive character of the Church of England, where almost any views are permitted. To be high means to value liturgy and chant, and to have some veneration for the Virgin Mary and the saints. It is to be what is known as an Anglo-Catholic. But not all Anglicans, or even most, held such views at the time that Lewis wrote. Others were low, which means to prefer a very Protestant approach, with no incense, with hymns, with a long sermon, without vestments even, and not even candles on the altar. Indeed, the altar for those who are low becomes only a table. These extremes were and are present in the Church of England. It is even possible to be an Anglican who doubts the Scriptures are true, does not believe in any of the miracles, and considers Jesus to have been a wise Jewish teacher and nothing more. When Lewis is writing about mere Christianity, he is writing first of all to the community to which he belongs, and there is already a great diversity of belief. This was not the situation found in his time in the Roman Catholic Church of Tolkien, or in the other Protestant groups such as Methodists and Baptists, let alone the Orthodox. In all of these other Christian communities, there was much less diversity of belief and practice than was and still is found in Anglicanism. So in one sense, he is writing as a Christian who has to live with diversity in his own personal experience, as an ordinary layman of the Church of England. He limits the scope of what he is speaking about, but not because his own faith is limited. Rather, it is so that what he speaks about will have the widest audience. But Lewis is already also appealing to a national audience. And so he has to restrict his subject matter to include rather than exclude as many as possible. He is also limited by the fact that his messages are no more than 15 minutes in length and are part of only a short series. If we start to look together at his introduction, we find that he uses it to explain himself to those who heard his radio broadcasts and were critical, as well as those who had read the small booklets in which each series was published. It is not part of the radio series, but it is his opportunity to explain his purpose and perspective. The introduction or preface is about 10 pages in length, and this is more than each of the short chapters that follows in the book. I am using the HarperCollins 2016 edition of the book. At first, Lewis describes the origins of his text as a series of radio programs. He speaks about the familiar and spoken quality of the text, intended to preserve the sense of it being a radio presentation. We have to remember that this is not a theological text. It is not intended to be a detailed explanation of Christianity with a study of every doctrine and every aspect of church history. It is a conversation about the basics of the Christian faith with the British people, many and most who were rather ignorant even of mere Christianity, in a language that could be understood and with arguments that could be appreciated. Lewis is also clear that he intends deliberately not to help people choose between different denominations. This is not a text which was written to promote Anglicanism above Methodism or Roman Catholicism or even Coptic Orthodoxy. If we are generous in our sympathy for Lewis and his objective, we see that he limits what he says about even his own beliefs for the sake of a greater purpose. He doesn't want to attract just a few people to Anglicanism or any other denomination, but he wants to attract many people to start making the journey towards Christianity. This is surely a good thing and something we can be in agreement with. Mere Christianity is not a theological rejection of orthodoxy, but an evangelistic expression of Christianity, much and most of which is in agreement with our Orthodox faith. Lewis makes it clear that this was always his purpose. He says, "Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbours was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times." What were his reasons for taking this approach and having this objective? He provides us with three ideas himself. Firstly, the things that divide Christians are matters of detailed theology and church history and require an expert treatment which Lewis felt was beyond him. Secondly, the discussion of disputed matters in a text intended for a general audience does not tend to be very attractive, and it leads to the confusion of those who need to first believe that there is one God and that Jesus Christ is his only Son. And thirdly, there are always others who are engaged in discussing these detailed and controversial points in whatever way is necessary. If we are to be generous in our sympathy, then we have to take C.S. Lewis at his word. He is not intending to produce a theological textbook, or even to describe his own theological understanding in any detail. Rather, he wants to present something which is a beginning for those who have little or no faith at all. But of course, in the years since he had broadcast these radio programs, and even today, he faced and faces criticism that he has avoided speaking about this or that teaching because he holds this or that view. He uses the example of the Virgin Mary in his introduction. Some people draw unwarranted conclusions from the fact that I never say more about the Blessed Virgin Mary than is involved in asserting the virgin birth of Christ. But surely my reason for doing so is obvious. To say any more would take me at once into highly controversial regions. I have myself often presented a program intending to help evangelicals and others understand our Orthodox faith a little better. I call it the Orthodox way of prayer, and usually the program includes our Agbeya and presentations on several aspects of Orthodox prayer, and usually a video about the Jesus prayer. I am not hesitant to teach about our spiritual life, but I am careful to use language which will communicate and not cause hostility or anxiety or opposition. This means, for instance, that however much I believe that our veneration of the Virgin Mary and the saints is entirely Christian, I do not address these topics when I'm trying to encourage non-Orthodox to take some small steps in experiencing only a few aspects of the Orthodox spiritual life of prayer. So I understand what C.S. Lewis means, and I have found such an approach to be necessary myself. We cannot say everything at once, and we have to begin at the beginning. Lewis continues, if any topic could be relied upon to wreck a book about mere Christianity, if any topic makes utterly unprofitable reading for those who do not yet believe that the Virgin Son is God, surely this is it. This makes sense to me when I am sympathetic to Lewis's intentions. We can imagine someone asking two Christians about what Christianity stands for. If they start arguing about particular teachings from the beginning, then it is unlikely that their inquirer will continue his spiritual search with them. This is not a matter of deceit, but it seems to be true that before a person considers who has the right understanding of the intercession of the Virgin Mary and the saints, they must begin by discovering the truth about God and the Holy Trinity and the incarnation of Christ. To begin with controversy and disagreement, even if we are properly sure that our own views are correct, will not usually lead to confidence in the Christian message. If we think that mere Christianity sounds too much like dismissing important aspects of our Orthodox faith, perhaps we should consider it, as Lewis did, as the basics of Christianity, which it seems to me we also understand and accept. If we had only 2 minutes to talk to someone about Christianity, what would we say? Perhaps we would all say something different, but we would surely focus on those things which are non-negotiable, and without which it is not possible to be any sort of Christian. Lewis says, oddly enough, you cannot even conclude from my silence on disputed points, either that I think them important or that I think them unimportant. For this is itself one of the disputed points. Whether we agree or not, Lewis believed that mere Christianity represented something positive and attractive. This mere Christianity expressed all that Christians had in common against the non-Christian and atheistic beliefs from which all Christians were separated by a vast chasm. Mere Christianity for Lewis, and we must be generous to his intention, is not Christianity without the difficult and complicated teachings, as if they did not matter. Rather, it is the beginning of a journey that Lewis hopes his listeners and readers will pursue. But he does not presume to guide each inquirer beyond these first steps. That is for others to accomplish. In his introduction, Lewis also speaks about his intention in writing part 3 of the book about moral matters. And he again expresses his hesitation in diving into things which he felt unsuited to address. In his own opinion, these included gambling and birth control. Just as it would be wrong for us to expect him to deal with every aspect of doctrine and theology, since that was not his purpose, so he should not be expected to deal with every moral matter either. If there are things which he does not consider and could not consider in the short space of time he was given on the radio and then in writing, this does not mean that he did not consider them important. Lewis seems to think that the greatest opposition to his writing came from those who denied that his idea of a mere Christianity common to all should be used as a definition of a Christian. There were and are many who reject all of the things he describes as being mere Christianity and want to insist that they are still Christian. It is not only Lewis and mere Christianity which are criticized by those who want to make a Christianity with no doctrines. Our Orthodox faith also faces criticism from those who think that we are too strict in our doctrine and dogma, our practices and our rites. Lewis says that someone said to him, "Who are you to lay down who is and who is not a Christian?" What they mean is, who are you to say that there are boundaries to the Christian faith and that is not simply a matter of personal opinion? His answer is useful to us, since we have to respond to the same questions. He very usefully draws a distinction between using the word Christian as some sort of compliment or to include everyone, and using it as a matter of fact, that this person holds beliefs and lives out those practices which are the definition of Christianity. When we call someone a Christian, we don't mean that they are a good person. Lewis insists we must therefore stick to the original and obvious meaning. The name Christian was first given at Antioch to the disciples, to those who accepted the teaching of the apostles. Far from avoiding the hard witness that Christianity represents, the difficult questions of life. Lewis wants us to see that it must mean more than being a good person. It must mean something in relation to the truth and the fact of God and the Trinity and Jesus Christ. It is only in the context of the depths of authentic and apostolic Christianity that his mere Christianity is found. And this is why he says, "I hope no reader will suppose that mere Christianity is here put forward as an alternative to the creeds of the existing communions, as if a man could adopt it in preference to Congregationalism or Greek Orthodoxy or anything else. It is more like a hall out of which doors open into several rooms." I like this idea, that mere Christianity is like entering a hallway or a vestibule, so that we understand it is not every word about Christianity, and certainly not the last word, but it is a beginning, so that what is said does truly describe the Christian faith, even the Orthodox Christian faith to a great extent, but more, much more, a lifetime more is required of the one who enters this hallway of faith. Towards the end of his introduction, Lewis expresses what this more is that he thinks is necessary of all. He says, "You must keep on praying for light. You must be asking which door is the true one, not which pleases you best." This seems to be an orthodox spiritual attitude for us to have and for us to commend in others. When we have begun the journey and have been attracted by mere Christianity, we must keep searching and seeking. We have not completed our journey. Indeed, it has hardly begun. It seems to me that C.S. Lewis is also expressing that important truth, that we are not responsible for the choices of others. We cannot make converts, and we can only disciple those who are willing and convinced. But we are to share the faith, beginning at the beginning, even though we cannot determine the choices that others will make. I have often said myself to those with whom I have spoken about orthodoxy that I want to make friends for orthodoxy and help people gain spiritual benefit in taking another step in their journey into union with God. But I cannot make them orthodox. Some will become Anglicans, some will become Catholics, some will continue as Protestants of one kind or another. That is their own experience and their own journey. But my responsibility, it seems to me, and our responsibility, is to find our own mere Christianity, our own basics of the truth about God and Christ, which are true to our own orthodox belief and experience, but which also do not try to say to someone too much all at once. Finally, in his introduction, Lewis says to us, "When you have reached your own room, be kind to those who have chosen different doors and to those who are still in the hall. If they are wrong, they need your prayers all the more." This seems a generous attitude which Lewis holds himself towards others and encourages us to have ourselves towards these others. We have chosen orthodoxy in one way or another. Perhaps we have been born into Orthodox families and were baptized in our infancy. There is still a very real sense that we must seek and choose the truth every day. Perhaps we have deliberately become Orthodox in our adult years, and this was itself as a result of a long period of searching. But we must also seek and choose every day. And our own conviction that orthodoxy is apostolic Christianity must not cause us to look down on others who are also seeking and searching and have made other choices. On the contrary, we need to always continue to be encouraging and generous of all those who are on the same journey of faith, though perhaps they are at a different stage in their lives in the will of God, and even if perhaps wrong choices have been made. When I first turned to mere Christianity, the very idea seemed contrary to orthodoxy. But as we appreciate what Lewis means by this idea, and that it is not intended to be a detailed theological system, or to replace any creed or even any denominational understanding, we start to see that there was and is value in a basic and simple presentation of the core dogma of Christianity, which indeed most Christians accept. Not as if it was the end of the journey, but as if it represented a beginning. So where does C.S. Lewis begin his mere Christianity? It is not perhaps where we would expect. In my own book on apologetics, Orthodox Christianity, Reasonable Faith, I begin with the almost universal sense that there must be more to life than the material. Others might begin with showing that faith in God is reasonable, but Lewis himself begins in a short chapter, the first of his radio broadcasts, by calling it the law of human nature. What does he mean by this? He speaks about how people often argue and become heated and angry because they feel that some injustice has taken place, either to them or to others. And he says that those who are arguing in this way are appealing to some kind of standard of behaviour which is expected the other person will know about. Lewis means that there is some kind of rule which those who argue and are angry with each other both acknowledge, even if they apply such a rule in different ways, to excuse themselves and accuse the other. The arguments that take place between people are intended to show that one is right and the other is wrong, and this requires that there is some innate sense of what right and wrong are, even if the application of right and wrong are different. We find this idea in the Bible. It was understood and agreed that you did good things to people who were good to you. Doing good was commendable. It was right behaviour. But it was only required to apply this good behaviour to those who were good to you. Jesus Christ took this idea of what was right, and he did not dispute it or change it. Rather, he changed how it was to be applied. We are to do good to all people, even those who do bad things to us. The idea that we should do good to people is universal, even while there are various ways this idea is limited in various circumstances and cultures. This is what Lewis meant by the law of human nature, and he explains it exactly, saying, people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. Taking the race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behaviour was obvious to everyone. We can imagine that this sort of idea had a great deal of weight in the first years of the Second World War. The things that the Nazis were doing in Germany and across Europe were not only unpleasant and worth resisting, but they were wrong. And they were wrong because of this universal sense of right and wrong. Lewis says, what was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong unless right is a real thing, which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought not to have practiced? This is where and how Lewis begins his description of Christianity, of mere Christianity. It is with an insistence that there is a right and wrong which people know even if they do not live it, and even if they reject and resist it. The Nazis are not simply horrible in their ideas, but they are wrong. And Lewis knows that most of those listening to him will think in such a way. Of course, Lewis is aware that there are people who disagree with him and with the idea of a universal morality. He recognizes that different cultures do apply morality in a different way, but his own extensive study of the moral codes of the various ancient civilizations allows him to insist that essentially they have the same elements. In our own times, with the development of the study of ethics, it is often proposed that various moral requirements are entirely relative. But Lewis notes that even if an academic teaches that stealing is not really wrong, and it's just wrong in our society, he will be very upset and demand justice if someone steals from him. We innately believe that there is right and wrong, and not just because we are taught it. We may not always know what is right and wrong in every situation, but we are sure that it exists, and that essentially right and wrong are not just a matter of personal choice. Indeed, even in our modern post-Christian and anti-Christian societies, it seems that we are more concerned with morality than ever before. but it is a rather oppressive morality without God. Even more than ever, things are right and wrong. But often the things we are told are right seem to most of us to feel very wrong. And many of the things we are told are wrong seem to many of us to feel very right, however much we are pressurized to change our thinking. Why does Lewis begin his account of mere Christianity here? It is because in this first short chapter he also wants to insist that we don't live up to this sense of right and wrong. We do feel uncomfortable that we do not always act in what he calls a decent manner. We do try to make excuses for our behaviour because we do have a sense of right and wrong, even if it is imperfect and even if it is coloured by our situation and culture. The last words of this short first chapter express what Lewis is saying. These then are the 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. They know the law of nature and they break it. Everything else that Lewis will go on to argue in this first section of his book depends on these ideas. And we can see that in one way they are not religious at all. He has not spoken about God or faith, but he is appealing to the universal experience of mankind. And this is where apologetics and evangelism properly begins. Throughout the study of this book, it is important to have in mind the purpose of Lewis in producing it. This is not a theology textbook, and it is not intended to say everything about Christianity, or to suggest that what is presented is Christianity itself. It is a beginning, and it begins where those who hear and read can identify themselves with the arguments he makes, even if they have no obvious and clear faith at all. Lewis is not an Orthodox Christian, and it would be unreasonable to expect him to always say things that we can agree with. There will be emphases in some of the chapters that we do not share or which we disagree with. I usually turn to passages on the incarnation and how it was that the death of Christ has saving value for us. And when I find where Lewis has written on this subject, I can see that he has tried hard to avoid any particular theory of what we call the atonement. And he does not force particular views on his readers, insisting that it is the death and resurrection which matter most, as they do. He chooses to be silent, where to say more would undermine his purpose and argument. This is not a textbook about the atonement. Lewis is an Anglican, essentially a Protestant. But countless Orthodox have found his writings valuable because he does avoid intruding ideas which are rather exclusively Protestant into his books. This does not weaken them. There are others who write in detail about all of these things he chooses to pass over more briefly. And this is perhaps where his value lies, and in his personal relationship with God, rediscovered as an academic in adulthood, and after a period of convinced atheism. He makes a beginning for us, and he leads us into the hall where many doors are opening off, and we must proceed further without him. But the insights he provides, the arguments he makes, and which are useful for our own experience, for all of these we should be grateful, and give thanks to God for the witness of the life and writings of Clive Staples Lewis. God bless your future study in this book, and remember to try and understand the writings of Lewis with generous sympathy and with a constructive criticism, placing his writings and his ideas in the context which I have described briefly now, so that we do him justice and we give him the opportunity to speak for himself without insisting on our own views in his place. God bless you all.